Hi, I'm Robert Sapolsky. I'm a professor of biology, neurology, and neurosurgery at Stanford University and a research associate at the National Museums of Kenya. Now, for many years, I've been teaching a class at Stanford called Human Behavioral Biology, which is a big survey course of the biological bases of human social behavior. In 2009, 2010 or so, when I was teaching it, Stanford recorded those lectures and posted them on YouTube. And nicely, that has got reviews since then. And even more nicely, there's been some scientific progress in the years since 2010 or so, and thus a lot of the material in those lectures are dated now. So I decided this last spring 2024, when I taught the class most recently, it was time to film it and post it as an updated version of the class. And thus, this is it. You'll be seeing the lectures were actually done remotely from the luxury of my living room. What you'll also see is this lecture right now today is not the one that was given to the class, but is instead specifically for this YouTube recording. That's for two reasons. First, to spare all of you from the stretch where I had to cover course mechanics and office hours and what date the exams would be on and such. And the second reason is I managed to forget to turn on the camera for that first lecture. So here we are with my redoing it. Now, one last thing, I want to acknowledge the tremendous role of Carlos Seligo of Stanford, who's been the producer and director of this filming and did all the editing and got rid of my ums and you knows and created all the visuals that you'll be seeing. And by created, I mean drew some of them, painted some of them spectacular. So, Carlos, thank you for this. It has been a pleasure working with you on this over the last year. Now, as one last note, Carlos and my beloved family are the ones who decided it made sense to start this lecture with my sitting here on the steps for some reason. So, on that note, I think we are going to go get started. We're going to start off with 5 scientific findings that I find to be very, very interesting and relevant to this class. First one. Take someone, a hypothetical student at Beijing University, who's going off to the coffee shop one afternoon to meet their friend. Student enters the coffee shop, and there's their friend sitting over at the other end, and they want to go over and greet them, except there's a slight problem, which is there's 2 tables here in the way, and somebody has moved the back of 2 chairs up against each other, so the pathway is blocked. So what are you going to do? There's one option, which is just walk around the tables and go to your friend. And there's another option, which is to go over to the chairs and pull them apart. And remarkably, you, that student, if your ancestors were rice farmers, you were more likely than chance to go around the tables. And if your ancestors were wheat farmers, you were more likely than chance to pull the chairs apart. Next finding, take some 5-year-olds and say, kids, okay, amazing news. Let's pretend we are going to take a journey to Candy Island. Well, there's going to be such amazing candy there, and you can have all you want, and it's going to be terrific. Of course, it's going to be a big journey getting their boat, getting to Candy Island, and there's going to be storms and pirates and krakens and stuff. And here's a picture of 2 people. Which one of those 2 do you want to be the captain of your ship going to Candy Island? And the kids choose. And in this study, the 2 people pictured were 2 politicians who ran against each other in an election. And take 5-year-olds and average out their choices, and they picked the individual who won the election 70% of the time. 5-year-olds were responding to some of the same things that allowed one to predict who was going to win an election. Next, Classic problem in philosophy, the runaway trolley problem. A trolley has broken loose from its brakes and is hurtling it down the tracks, and inconveniently, 5 people have been super glued to the tracks there, and the trolley's going to hit them and kill them, and you have a decision to make, which is there's a side spur. And you can pull a lever and send the trolley onto the side spur where, just as inconveniently, there's one person who's glued to those tracks. You have to make the decision. Do you choose to sacrifice the life of that one person in order to save those 5? Classic problem in sort of utilitarian philosophy, and there's a entire universe of ways in which you get people to give different answers. So in this study, the hypothetical person glued to the tracks on the side spur, the one you have to decide if you're sacrificing them or not, they're given a name. You're told their name. And in this study, it was shown that when you raise the levels of the hormone oxytocin in people, if that hypothetical person has a name that's familiar to you, one of your nationality, one of your co-religionists, whatever, you become significantly less likely to deter the trolley to go and kill them. And if the person has the name from a group that is a historical enemy, that's a nationality that you have negative connotations over, and oxytocin makes you more likely to sacrifice their life. Fourth interesting finding. Take a fetus who somewhere earlier in fetal life made the incredibly important decision as to whose womb it wanted to spend 9 months in. And by 3rd trimester, a finding as follows. If you have made the gravely imprudent decision of picking the womb of a woman who is poor, of low socioeconomic status, by the time you were 3rd trimester, on the average, your brain volume will be less than is typical. Your brain development will have been lagging because of the impact of poverty on your mother. Final example. Take some women, heterosexual women, show them pictures, faces, and men, and ask them to rate their attractiveness, and you see something interesting, which is if women are ovulating right around the time of their cycle where estrogen is very high, and they're given 2 pictures to look at, 2 faces there, and they are more likely than chance to pick the rugged secondary male sexual characteristics of sharp jawline and big forehead and insouciant bedroom eyes and what else? This guy who's just like his hotness is just so apparent. But then take women and get them later in the cycle when their progesterone levels are rising and women's facial preference in men goes in the direction of rounder faces, softer features, kinder looking individuals. And instead of going for the hot guy, you're now thinking, a guy on the right, he's going to be amazing taking the kids out to buy a Christmas tree. And where you are in your cycle, what your hormone levels are, will influence what you find to be the most attractive face. What we're seeing is all sorts of stuff going on underneath the surface influencing us. What your mother's status was when you were a fetus, what sort of culture your ancestors came up with, what hormone levels you have this morning. All of these are telling us something important, critical to this class, which is when we look at human behavior, we cannot look at it out of the context of we are biological organisms. And we have to understand the biology that underpins who we are. Now, the course is built around 2 manifestations of that notion. We are biological organisms, we're just another animal, all of that. 2 pieces that come together that sort of buttress this class. First is summarized in these 4 items here. Having your period, having a brain tumor, eating lots of junk food, taking anabolic steroids. Now, all 4 of these things have something in common. look at it and you say, well, something biological, something with the body or the brain or something. Do they have something to do with hormones? Maybe you're getting warmer, having your period, having a brain tumor, eating lots of junk food, taking anabolic steroids. And it turns out all four of these have been used by defense attorneys in courtrooms to mitigate convictions for violent crimes. First one, having your period. A small subset of women with severe perimenstrual behavioral changes include violence, and at least in one murder trial in England, that was viewed as a mitigating factor. The woman's violence, and in fact, her history of violence, was always right around the perimenstrual period. That is a factor. Brain tumors, brain abnormalities, cavernous malformations, things of that sort in the brain have been used successfully in courtrooms as mitigating factors. It was the person's brain tumor that was responsible for them acting irrationally violent from out of nowhere. History buffs will know back when a guy named Dan White, a disappointed office seeker, went and assassinated the mayor of San Francisco, George Moscone, and Harvey Milk, a supervisor. And in the trial afterward, much was made of the fact that Dan White ate tons and tons of junk food, sugary junk food, and his defense attorneys argued that this produced wild fluctuations in his circulating glucose levels, and it's well known that can have effects on behavior, and that's why he acted in such an unstable manner, and this played a role in him having a lessened sentence, what is now known historically as the Twinkie defense. Finally, anabolic steroids, hormones related to testosterone that weightlifters often abuse, and take enough of this stuff and you become more aggressive. We're going to look at that in so much detail somewhere down the line. And the fact that someone was a chronic abuser of anabolic steroids has also been successfully used as a mitigating defense in a courtroom. So what are we learning from these four things? Our first arc that will dominate this course, which is sometimes the things going on in your body, the foods you've eaten, the hormones you've taken, the endocrine, all of that, sometimes what's going on in your body can vastly influence your brain and behavior. Now, the second branch. Tonight, just before you go to sleep, you're in bed, you're nice and drowsy, you're lying there, you're relaxed, you can hear your heart beating slowly. Think the following thought. You know that heart isn't going to beat forever. Really stop and think about it. Think about there is that inevitable final beat, thinking about your blood flow coming to a halt after that and all your blood vessels. Think about your toes starting to turn blue. And the odds are you are going to activate a physiological stress response. You're going to start breathing faster. Your heart rate is increasing. You're going to secrete some stress hormones, and you will have not just done anything physically really demanding. You won't have just run up a flight of stairs with a cow on your back. All you're doing is showing the second point. Sometimes mere thought, mere memory, mere emotion can change the workings of your body. And out of this will come these two cornerstones of this course, the effects of bodily states on the brain and behavior, the effects of brain and behavior on the body. Out of that emerging concepts like mind and psyche, and how does this all work? How does this all work? I can tell you the punchline for the entire course right now, which is every single version of this that we're going to look at, the answer is going to be, it's complicated. It's complicated. This doesn't cause that. This modulates this instead. There's these interactive factors. There's multiple routes by which it's complicated. It's complicated. This is complicated. And this is complicated in a very particular way because of what we're trying to understand. You want to understand why, like all of the Serengeti's wildebeest come into mating season in the same week or so each spring.
Oh, you can figure it out. That's complicated, and you can get an answer to that. Or how birds migrate from somewhere in the tropics to somewhere in the Arctic each year. How does that work? Those are complicated problems to understand. The brain affecting the body, affecting the brain, and all of that. And that can be plenty difficult. But no, we're going after something much, much more challenging because we're interested in human behavior, in human social behavior, and as we'll see, often in abnormal human social behavior, and even more so, cases where human social behavior is abnormal and appalling in the eyes of some observers and heroic in the eyes of others. This is way, way complicated. And over, as we look at how the roots of behavior are based in biology, we're going to see it's incredibly complicated, nuanced, interactive, multiple factors contributing to challenges to understand. So when we face very complicated things like that, we tend to have a certain cognitive approach that makes the massively difficult more tractable, which is we break the problem down into pieces. We break it down into different parts, which we label, we put them into different categories. What do I mean by this? What were the causes of the War of Jenkins' Ear in 1740, which was between Spain and Britain, and Spanish pirates, with the approval of the Spanish government, had taken over some British ship and cut off the ear of Jenkins, the captain, and this produced a war between the two. And you can say, okay, so what were the historical causes of the War of Jenkins' Ears? And you can have a geopolitical analysis of it. You could have an economic analysis. You could have a religious analysis of Catholic Spain going after Protestant England, or the other way around. You can have an anatomical analysis as to just how much of Jenkins' ear came off and what they did with it afterward. And you could take a very complex thing and break it into pieces. And most importantly, you hand each of those pieces to an expert, an economist, a religious history expert, whatever. You take complicated things and you break them up into categories. And most importantly, we do this for things where we are looking at a smooth continuum, where there's no obvious transition from this to this to this to this, a smooth continuum. And what we do, we break it into categories. We put up arbitrary boundaries to produce different categories of this overall phenomenon. Great example of this, which is the visual spectrum. It's a whole arc, a continuous arc of changing wavelengths. It's just a smooth continuum. And what is done in language after language, arbitrary boundaries are imposed on the visual spectrum, arbitrary linguistic boundaries, and everyone agrees from here to here, we're going to call it yellow. And from here to here, we're going to call it orange. We're going to break it in there with these arbitrary boundaries. And why do we do that? Because this helps. This helps our memory. Great example of this. A study done looking at English speakers and Russian speakers. In English, there is one primary term for blue, for the color blue. Primary blue as opposed to bluish or bluish greenish, just a pure singular term. There's one term for a range in the visual spectrum, which in English we call all of those blue. That falls into the blue bucket. Meanwhile, if you are a Russian speaker, blue is broken up into two different essential terms. One of them is goluboy, mispronounced no doubt, which is light blue, or sini, which is dark blue. There's an arbitrary boundary in the middle of blue for Russian speakers, which English speakers don't have. And what is shown in these studies is Russians have a better memory. Is this a shade of blue I've seen before or not? They have a better memory for that than English speakers have because they've got two buckets of categorization rather than oh, it was some kind of blue. They at least have two different buckets to toss in there. It helps your memory. Thinking categorically, thinking in terms of explanatory buckets is helpful. It helps our memory. So that's great. That's why we tend to do that. But what becomes critical here is there's downsides to thinking categorically about complicated things. Because when you impose a bunch of arbitrary boundaries, you wind up deciding the boundaries are more important than they arbitrarily are, and it disrupts your ability to see the whole picture. First example, so you have some two arbitrary boundaries, some bucket, some category here, whatever, and there's two observations within it. And because they are within the same bucket, people tend to see them as more similar to each other than they actually are. People tend to underestimate their difference. Let me give you a great example of this. Different languages, you can hear two different TH sounds and they have different meanings, or vocal languages, or there just so happens in English, the letter B and the letter P are separate letters and mean different things. We have an arbitrary boundary between whatever is going on phonologically to go from B to P. We in English decide there's a boundary in between. In lots of other languages, there's not a boundary, and B and P are the same letter and they're heard the same way. So this was some years ago, and I got it into my head. I was studying baboons in East Africa, that it was time to do some testicular biopsies on some of my males. You know, everybody reaches that point in life where it's time to learn how to do a testicular biopsy on a baboon. So I went to a urology professor over at the med school to get advice on how to do this, and a very nice guy who happened to be from Finland, and he was taking me through the whole procedure and showing me do this at this point and then you do that. And he said, you know, once you get the hang of it, it's really quite simple. You know what? You should go and practice on a bear. And I said, a bear? What are you talking about? He said, yeah, I know it sounds strange, but go practice on a bear. The texture is surprisingly similar. And we have all the medical residents practice on bears. And I said, are you crazy? I'm supposed to do this to a bear? He said, yeah, a bear or an apple. Oh, in Finnish, B's and P's are not distinguished between. For him, they were interchangeable sounds and they meant something very different in English. So two factoids wind up in the same bucket, the same arbitrary bucket, and you see them as more similar than they actually are. The other problem, the complementary one, is two factoids wind up on either side of an arbitrary boundary. And what we do distortively is we see them as more different than they actually are. And we saw a great example of this in the last presidential election during the period when it was still Trump versus Biden. And an enormous amount was made about the age difference, Biden's aged state and Trump being a younger man. And what was it? Biden was in his early 80s, Trump was in his mid to late 70s, not that many years apart. Yet, the age difference, Biden as an old man, was something relentlessly emphasized by the Trump camp. And in fact, polls showed that among Trump supporters, they tended to overestimate the age difference between the two. So we begin to see breaking complicated things into categorical buckets of arbitrary properties and such helps our memory, but at the same time, it also distorts. We see some things as more similar than they actually are, some things as more different, and this winds up getting in the way of really understanding what's going on. So our goal in all of this is to resist that. And resisting it is challenging because our brain, even on a cellular level, works in this way of liking to break things into categories. Wonderful example of this, a study some years ago out of MIT. Okay, you take some monkeys and you show them pictures. You show them pictures of cats and show them pictures of dogs, and you can identify neurons in the cortex in these animals that are cat neurons that always respond to pictures of cats, and dog neurons. And now what you do is, with some computer graphics, you mix the two. You can start off with a 100% cat image and now intermix so it's 80% cat, 20% dog, 60-40, 40-60, 20-80, 100% dog, intermediate forms, just a smooth continuum of a mixture of cat and dog together. And what you see in the diagram is the responsiveness of a cat neuron, a neuron that responds to pictures of cats. And you see how it responds at 100% cat, and it's responding still to 80% and 60%. And then suddenly there's a boundary. As you go from majority cat, 60%, to majority dog, down to 40% cat, there's a big break there. There's a break, and you can see explicitly here the size of the bar in 60% cat and 100% cat versus 60 and 40, and you see that neuron is irrationally falling for categorization, labeling something, because it is seeing the difference between 60 and 40 as being bigger than the difference between 60 and 100. Even your neurons do that distortively. So our goal in the class is, at every single juncture, to resist the pull towards thinking categorically about behavior. Now, what would that look like? Categorical sort of attributions of where behavior is coming from. You got some chicken, some female chicken, and over there is this male chicken rooster. The female chicken is ovulating and she does some sexually solicitive thing with her wings, and this is the most exciting thing the male has ever seen. She's across the street and he comes running over to her to mate, and thus we have a behavioral biological question, which is, why did the rooster cross the road? And you can answer that from the bucket of anatomy. An anatomist would say, well, chickens, their pelvis and their leg bones at this particular angle, and it makes it possible for them to run. That's how that just happened. Or you could do it from the standpoint of an endocrinologist saying, well, male chickens that have higher than this level of androgens will respond to the solicitive gesture from the female, and it's an endocrine phenomenon. And then you can get the evolutionary biologist and saying, well, over the centuries that male chickens who responded to gestures like that from females left more copies of their genes, and thus it has evolved that is a responsiveness in male chickens to females doing this, and all these different disciplinary explanations. And not only do we have the problem there of distortions that come in and telling how similar or different two facts are, but we also have the distortion of people deciding that they could explain the entire world from their explanatory bucket, that you could understand all of behavior by understanding this one gene, this one part of the brain, this one hormone, this one developmental phenomenon, this one of evolutionary, that you could explain it all from the perspective of a single discipline. And our goal, our challenge every step of the way, is to avoid this and view all of these behavioral phenomena from the standpoint of multidisciplinary perspectives. Now, what is that going to look like in the course? You are walking in a bad neighborhood and you're passing a stranger who says, "Gee, can you stop a sec? I want to ask you something." And now we have this question, are you going to stop or not? What is the biology now that's going to go into whether or not you stop to engage with the stranger? So you can answer this like a neurobiologist. What's going to determine whether or not you stop? Well, the events in milliseconds before in parts of your brain that we're going to hear lots about, the motor cortex and the frontal cortex, and what was the basal level of activity in different brain regions, what was going on a millisecond ago. And if you're a certain type of neurobiologist, that's how you explain why you will either have stopped or continued walking. But then you can also look at the perspective of sensory physiology, which is what was going on in the previous seconds to minutes. What's the person's face who's talking to you? Is it appealing? Is it the face of a them? Are you aware of what the neighborhood is that you're in? Are you aware of sensory information coming in your body? Are you hungry? Are you feeling tired? All of these are going to influence the decision that that part of your brain is going to make, sending a command either to stop and engage or keep walking. But then we also have to bring in endocrinology and look at in the previous, I don't know, hours to days, what were your hormone levels like? What were your levels of estrogen and testosterone and progesterone and cortisol and vasopressin and oxytocin? Because all of those are working in your brain to make certain regions more or less sensitive to this sort of stimulus or that sort of trigger. So that's part of the story also. But then you've got to consider the previous years, months, years, decades, and the whole phenomenon of neuroplasticity, another domain of neurobiology. Neuroplasticity, did you go through some unbelievable, horrible trauma somewhere in your past that has left you with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? And what that involves is the very structure of a part of your brain called the amygdala changes, it enlarges. The neurons there grow new connections, they become more excitable, and you have an amygdala and less a brain that is perceiving threats that other people may not. We're hypersensitive to the possibility of threats. Or did you just spend the previous 3 decades, traveling the world and having happy experiences, sort of experiencing all sorts of different cultures and broad-mindedness? And has that made you a more socially intelligent creature with a frontal cortex that will have changed structurally? What's been going on in those years? Because that's going to be shaping the type of brain region you have, responding to those hormones, which will be responding to that sensory stimulus, deciding what's your behavior going to be now. Then we got to push even further back. Now, suppose this person is asking you to stop because they want to sell you something very illegal, but very tempting, and you've got to figure out, are you going to resist or not? And this is going to have something to do with your late adolescence, when you were undergoing your last big building project in your brain, the formation in its mature form of your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that does gratification postponement and impulse control and makes you do the right thing when it's the hard thing to do. And how you wired up your prefrontal cortex then is going to predict a whole lot as to whether or not you are going to stop and give in to temptation here or just keep walking. And then we barrel back to childhood, where you were constructing your brain. You were constructing your brain based on the world you were experiencing. Were you learning the world is a safe, benevolent place? The world is a menacing place that you have to be tough and suspicious about? Are you learning that the past is wonderful, the past is the past, the future is exciting, the future is terrifying? All versions of, are you going to stop at this point or not? But remarkably, what was going on back in your fetal life? And people who study fetal brain programming will be very interested as well. Because suppose, for example, when you were a fetus, your mother was starving. As a result, a very well understood phenomenon, you develop what is called a thrifty metabolism. And among other things, if this person you're walking past is saying, hey, I want to ask you something. Would you like to buy this huge amount of cotton candy? And at that point, Your thrifty metabolism, which was set into place, programmed when you were a fetus, is going to have something to do with how readily you resist the craving to go for it at that point. So, all the way back to fetal life, all the way back to you when you were nothing more than a fertilized egg, and your genes, behavior genetics, genes that you started off life with, genes that will influence, for example, how stable your relationships are with loved ones. Where might that be pertinent? Where now the person is offering something very tempting, and you have to test your stability, your fidelity in your relationship. And it turns out a gene that codes for something called the vasopressin receptor has something to do with that. Gene's relevant to how easily provoked you are, how much self-control you can show, what sort of cravings you have. Genes are relevant. So it seems like that should cover everything. But remarkably, then you've got to go even further back. You've got to go back centuries, millennia to what sort of cultures your ancestors were inventing. Were they inventing notions as to about how many gods there are or how many spouses there should be? And do you enter heaven with good works, or do you enter heaven by killing enemies in battle? And is the body beautiful or is the body sinful? And all those things. And that will be influencing what you decide in that moment, because culture handed down, handed down, handed down will have been influencing how your mother mothered you within minutes of birth in some really dramatic ways. Then you got to push even further back. What kind of ecosystems were your ancestors living in? Because different types of ecosystems produce different sorts of cultures. And finally, you got to go all the way down to the bottom of the barrel, back hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of years. Evolution. How did you evolve into being a member of the species? What your species is like? Why did we humans, for example, evolve to be less polygamous than bonobos are, but more polygamous than gibbons are? How did that happen? How did that? So you make your decision, you pause or you keep walking, and an observer says, whoa, why did that person do that? Because of what was happening in their brain, because of this morning's hormone levels, because when they were a fetus, because of the culture they were raised in. Why does a behavior occur? Because of everything that came starting in the brain from a few milliseconds ago to millions of years of evolution and everything in between. Everything in between, forming this smooth continuum of causality of our behavior, whereas we saw just arbitrarily break it up. This is a biochemical explanation. This is a developmental psychology explanation. This is a cultural anthropology one, putting it into separate buckets of explanation, and they are not separate categories. They all merge into one. For example, you're talking about the effects of genes on behavior. By definition, you are talking about millions of years of evolution when those genes evolved. And also, by definition, you were talking about a fetal environment where some of those genes were programmed to be permanently active or permanently silenced. And by definition, you were talking about how active these genes were at making their proteins this morning while you were having breakfast. It all turns into one big arc of causality, of interaction. And at every single juncture, we are going to resist the temptation to decide that there is an explanation within this bucket, which is more implicitly important, more intrinsically explanatory than this bucket or that bucket, to instead think in a bucket-free manner. Okay, so that is our goal, and that sounds wonderful and noble and heroic, and maybe this is like not such a big deal, and I'm just setting up this sort of pompous straw man. Yeah, what am I saying? Ooh, you got to think in multifaceted ways about complicated stuff. Obviously, scientists do that. Even if someone winds up as a scientist, as a specialist in one bucket, they know the importance of other buckets. They just can only put their efforts into one. Scientists understand that you don't get easy questions as to what are the causes of behavior. They're complicated. Scientists are smarter than that. Let me give you three examples of scientists who were thinking about the causes of behavior in ways showing they were pathologically stuck inside a single bucket of explanation. First scientist, and a quote from him. Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. This was John Watson. John Watson, early in the last century, John Watson, one of the fathers of a field of psychology, behaviorism, which dominated American psychology for much of the 20th century, built around the fact that reward makes some behaviors more likely to happen. Punishment makes other behaviors less likely to happen. Reinforcers, you can shape behaviors to some extent. And what every aspect of science has shown with respect to behaviorism is nonetheless, it has its limits. You cannot take anyone at random and turn them into anyone you choose them to be by controlling the rewards and punishments in their environment. And Watson, with this view, was pathologically stuck in this bucket of rewards and punishments shape behavior, that we are infinitely malleable. And we're not. Next quote. Normal psychic life depends upon the good functioning of brain synapses, and mental disorders appear as a result of synaptic derangements. It is necessary to alter these synaptic adjustments and change the paths chosen by the impulses in their constant passage so as to modify the corresponding ideas and force thought into different channels. Okay, brain synapses, if you're not familiar with the term, you will be within a few lectures. Don't panic at this point. It's something going on in the brain. So we've got synaptic derangements and synaptic adjustments. Something's working wrong in a deranged matter, and you go in and you adjust. What sort of adjustments are we thinking about here? Some sort of like meditational retraining, or maybe some medication or something? No, that's not what this guy was talking about. This was the Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz upon the occasion of his getting the Nobel Prize for inventing frontal lobotomies. You know, somebody's having some synaptic derangements and go in and make a little synaptic rearrangement with a big old ice pick and lop out part of the brain there. And this was someone pathologically within this bucket that you could describe, you could explain, you could control behavior simply based on aspects of neuroanatomy. Final quote, worst one yet. The immensely high reproduction rate in the moral imbecile has long been established. Socially inferior human material is enabled to penetrate and finally to annihilate the healthy nation. The selection for toughness, heroism, social utility must be accomplished by some human institution if mankind, in default of selective factors, is not to be ruined by domestication-induced degeneracy. The racial idea as the basis of our state has already accomplished much in this respect. We must and should rely on the healthy feelings of our best and charge them with the extermination of elements of the population loaded with dregs. Now, who was this scientist? No, not that behavioral biologist Adolf Hitler. He was a little bit busy, but this was one of his main scientific propagandists named Konrad Lorenz. Konrad Lorenz, we grew up on those National Geographic specials. Konrad Lorenz, Nobel laureate, one of the fathers of the field of ethology. Konrad Lorenz, who in addition to doing adorable studies with his little duckies, where he'd be in his Austrian shorts and his Austrian pipe there and the ducks following him, an adorable Konrad Lorenz was, among other things, a Nazi propagandist for Hitler, talking about racial purity, providing scientific justification justifications for the notion that he played an active role in deciding whether some prisoners of war were executed or not based on their assessed racial purity. And he spent the rest of his life denying he ever had anything to do with it and went to his grave without apologizing. These are not three mediocre scientists. These are not people who labored in obscurity in Podunk University. These were among the most influential scientists of the last century. They shaped educational systems and who you bother trying to educate in what ways, believing what things can be changed and what things can't be. They influenced the ability to take somebody and against their will permanently damage their brain in the belief that this was the fix for a problem, what often was not even a problem. They played a role in sort of projecting a solution onto something that didn't need solving, and before you knew it, millions of people had died. These were powerful, influential scientists who did enormous damage out of a pathological focus on their own bucket of science, their own bucket of pseudoscience, and it is filled, history books are filled with examples of scientists who were just delighted, thrilled to throw objectivity out the window and start goose marching their way into hell with ideologues. This is what we have to resist in the class. We're going to resist easy explanations because easy ones lead to ideological solutions that can often be disasters. Okay, so this is going to be the goal in here. And as we begin to accumulate all these factoids that are going to be relevant to the class, we're going to see it's using this approach. We're going to first, in the first half of the course, do quick primers, 2-3 days on the basics of evolution, the basics of behavior genetics, of ethology, of endocrinology, all of that. With that under our belts, then in the second half of the course, we're going to take our knowledge of all these disciplines and apply them to individual types of behavior: love, parental behavior, sexual behavior, aggression, competition, cooperation, compassion, language use, various mental illnesses, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety disorders. And in each case, we are going to use the same strategy. Here's this behavior. First, what does this behavior actually consist of? Because some of the time the answer is surprising when you really do look closely, but then say, okay, this individual has just carried out this behavior, wonderfully altruistic, horribly damaging, ambiguously in between. Why did that happen? What went on in their brain milliseconds ago? What in their environment seconds ago triggered that behavior? What do their hormone levels this morning have to do with that? What about recent decades? What about their adolescence, childhood, fetal life, genes, ancestry, culture, ecology, evolution, all of that? Where do we get insight? By stepping backward in time as to where all these influences played out in explaining this behavior. That is going to be our strategy. Now, as we get inundated with factoids about this along the way, you're going to see there's going to be 3 different types of challenges that will arise. The first one will be accepting circumstances where we are exactly like every other species out there. The second challenge will be making sense of circumstances where we are using the same basic blueprint, the same basic plumbing as all sorts of other species out there, but in ways that are totally novel. And third category, being able to appreciate circumstances where we do things for which there's no precedent whatsoever in any other species out there. Let me give you some examples of each. First one, where it turns out we're doing the same exact thing as other species. Sit down people and have them rate the attractiveness of faces. And as something that's been known for well more than a century, people are more attracted to faces that are symmetrical. Facial symmetry, body symmetry is attractive in humans. Humans like that. And there's logical explanations, marks of illness and injury and smallpox lesions are rarely produce a nicely symmetrical face. Symmetry is a good marker for health, is a good marker for conventional well-being. Humans like symmetrical faces. That's something. But then you take a monkey who has a choice as to how long they want to look at different faces, how long they look, and monkeys prefer monkey faces that are more symmetrical. You take a fish, you do the same thing. Who even knew fishes have faces? But fish prefer symmetrical fish faces. This liking of symmetry, it's not just us, it's exactly the same in all sorts of other species. A second domain, one where we're using the same basic biological programming and instrumentation in a completely novel way. You take someone who is intent on carrying out a violent act. He is trying to kill an enemy who he's been searching for a long time, a wily, evasive energy. And our guy has to have patience and trickiness and intuition and cleverness and finally gets an opening and takes out the enemy and kills them. And the odds are that this person's physiology at that time will be identical to that of some male baboon who's just savaged the belly of his rival with his sharp canine somewhere on the savannah. Heart rate increases, breathing faster, all sorts of hormones being released, a sympathetic nervous system reaction, exactly the same as in that baboon, except this soldier is sitting in an air-conditioned bunker in an Air Force base in Nevada, operating a drone on the other side of the planet. And what has been remarkable is the discovery, some of the psychological impact, some of the physiological impact of trauma on drone operators. Nobody thought that was possible. And it's got much to do with the fact that this person ends his day trying to kill people 3 continents away, and then has to remember to pick up the dry cleaning on the way home before he gets back home and kisses his children and holds them and can't believe how much he loves them. And the next day he's off trying to kill people on the other side of the planet. We activate the same physiology under circumstances that are unprecedented. We kill people whose faces we never see on the other side of the globe, and we use the same circuitry of aggression as would a baboon. Final category, one in which we simply have no precedent out there in the animal kingdom. We are unique. Nobody else does this. Let me give you an example, a shocking example. You have a couple, they come home from work at the end of the day, they talk, they have dinner, they talk some more, eventually they go to bed, they have sex, they talk, they fall asleep. The next day, they do the same thing. They come back from work, they talk, they have dinner, they talk, they do taxes, they go to bed, they have sex, they talk some more, they fall asleep. They do this every day for 30 days in a row. Hippos would be made queasy by this, by how bizarre and deviant this is. Hardly any other species has non-reproductive sex day in, day out, over hardly any, and no other species talks about it afterward as to whether it was good for you or not. When we get to aspects of human sexual behavior, linguistic behavior, all of that, we are off on our own with completely unique behaviors there. So that is going to be our broad goal in here, to understand the biological roots of human social behavior, remembering, avoiding categorical bucketing of disciplinary explanations, and instead relishing the complexity of all these interactions. As we do that, not only to get a better understanding about what's going on, but to avoid the temptation of easy explanations that often lead one into ideology, and throughout dealing with some ways in which we are really challenging and that there's no difference between us and other animals, to the other extreme ways in which we are completely unique. So that is going to be the game plan, and welcome to the class.